Somewhere along the path of awakening, perhaps after a seismic spiritual revelation or the quiet shattering of a personal identity, you felt the ground shift beneath you. What was once familiar became foreign. You pierced through the veil of illusion, saw the machinery of your patterns, the deafening noise of the world, and then came the silence. At first, that silence felt sacred, empowering even, like stepping out of a burning building into clean air. But slowly, subtly, meaning dissolved, not as a catastrophe, but as a quiet disappearance, as if your soul dimmed the lights on life and forgot to turn them back on. You stopped striving. You stopped performing, not out of despair, but in a kind of sacred exhaustion, a hollowing that felt strangely peaceful, but unnervingly still. And then the whisper began, a quiet, aching question. Why do I feel so empty, now that I finally see the truth? This is the paradox no one warns you about. We are led to believe that spiritual awakening will inflame our purpose, that seeing through illusion will make us burn with clarity. But for many, especially the sensitive ones, the seekers, the empaths, the inward travelers, it does something else. It empties the vessel. It scrapes out all false motives until even desire becomes unrecognizable. And in that void, we confuse awakening with apathy. I recall a conversation with a dear friend, brilliant, spiritually attuned, fluent in the texts of Eckhart Tolle, Krishnamurti, Alanwatts. She emerged from a dark night of the soul with crystalline insight. She told me she saw through the illusions of identity, achievement, external love. And yet 2 months later, I found her lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, adrift in a stillness she did not expect. I used to cry about not doing enough, she said. Now, I don't care if I do anything at all. I thought awakening would set me on fire. Instead, I feel extinguished. Carl Jung spoke directly to this threshold. He described it as the sacred terrain between the collapse of the ego and the birth of the self. A liminal space, terrifying in its quiet, where motivation once powered by persona and social approval dissolves, leaving only the raw clay of what has not yet been shaped. This is not failure. This is individuation, the chrysalis stage of the psyche, where the caterpillar dissolves into formlessness before becoming the butterfly. It is the psychological death required for rebirth. But we must not mislabel this void as regression. For in the heart of this emptiness lives a deeper call, a quiet pulse of soul truth, waiting to be heard. Not the motivation to prove, but the impulse to be. To move, not out of need for recognition, but out of inner resonance. This article is not about despair. It is about the moment after awakening, when the old fuel dies and the new source of energy is still forming. Jung understood, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The loss of motivation is not the end. It is the sacred beginning of living not as a mask, but as a soul. Carl Jung, the architect of analytical psychology, foresaw this strange and silent fog that descends after awakening long before it became a topic of modern spiritual circles. He didn't cloak it in mysticism or euphoric language. He spoke with piercing clarity about the soul's descent into its own depths once the unconscious begins to stir. Enlightenment, Jung once wrote, does not come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And while those words may sound poetic, they carry a terrible truth. Real awakening does not crown you with bliss. It strips you. It unravels the scaffolding of the false self. It initiates a slow and sacred death. The death of who you believed yourself to be. The collapse is internal but fast-reaching. Your former motives, ambition, achievement, recognition begin to dissolve. The timelines you followed, the goals that once pulled you forward, even the structures of identity that defined your relationships, your work, your daily rhythm, begin to fade like mirages in the light of a deeper truth. But here's where the psychological nuance is vital. Your ego does not disappear, it does not die, it simply becomes disoriented. The script it once followed has been burned, but no new script has yet emerged. The result is not laziness or apathy, but a profound spiritual limbo. You are no longer asleep, but you are not yet fully awake into what comes next. This is the mystery, what Jung called the nigredo, the blackening phase of alchemy, when the ego has been dismantled, but the self has not yet taken the throne. In modern terms, it looks like demotivation, but in Jungian language, it is a holy pause, an in-between space where the soul retreats inward to rewrite its myth. And yet our culture fears this silence. Jung warned that the modern world does everything it can to avoid this phase, to pathologize it, numb it, medicate it, because it cannot comprehend a transformation that doesn't look like progress. But what you're experiencing is not regression, it is initiation. It is not dysfunction, it is sacred descent. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may share its shadows. It is the soul refusing to participate in a life it no longer resonates with. And that, Jung believed, was the beginning of individuation, the sacred becoming of the true self. Most people never speak of this part, do they? The ache after the light, the silence after the revelation. But this silence is not empty, it is formative. And if you can learn to stand still inside it, to listen to what it asks of you, you may come to see that what looks like demotivation is actually the beginning of a deeper alignment. The world tells you you're lost. Jung would say, you are being reformed by something far more honest. And that's exactly what we will begin to explore next. If you've been drifting through the haze that follows awakening, staring into the stillness where your spark once burned bright, know this, you are not broken. You are undergoing a profound psychic shift that our culture has no name for. A metamorphosis so deep, it does not merely challenge your thoughts, it reconfigures the very architecture of your inner world. The ambitions that once lit a fire in your chest, the deadlines, the goals, the 5-year visions, the motivational mantras of hustle, now fall flat. Not because you've failed, but because the very structure that once housed your motivation is disintegrating. Carl Jung foresaw this unraveling long before it was ever whispered on digital platforms. Let us understand it clearly. For most of your life, your energy came from the persona, the constructed self, the mask you wore to move through the world. That identity, the one who wanted to be admired, validated, applauded, was not a flaw. It was a necessary stage of human development. As Jung wrote, the persona is a system of behavior which is imposed upon the individual by the expectations of society. But when you awaken, you begin to see the mask for what it is, a performance. And the performance no longer compels you. You can't chase applause once you've seen that the stage is made of illusion. The result? The goals you once revered now feel foreign. They were written by a self that no longer lives in you. And this creates an eerie silence within, like an actor stepping off stage and forgetting their lines. Not out of confusion, but because the script no longer resonates with the soul. You feel aimless, not because you've lost your direction, but because you've shed the identity that required a destination. You didn't lose your drive. You outgrew the fuel that once powered it. What stirs within you now is not absence, but a sacred pause. A quiet void preparing to be filled by something truer. Something no longer forged from performance, but from presence. The ego pushed. The soul waits. And in that waiting, something holy begins. Carl Jung believed that the aim of life is not to exalt the ego, but to integrate it into a larger, deeper psychic totality. We are not here to serve the ego's desires, but to refine it, temper it, and align it with the self, the transcendent center of our being that connects us to the greater whole. He called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of moving from fragmentation to inner unity. Not to become the self that is praised, but to become the self that is real. The self, unlike the ego, is unconcerned with approval or performance. It is not driven by ambition, but by alignment. Its only desire is to express what is true. And so, after a spiritual awakening, the psyche begins a sacred recalibration. What once felt exciting now feels hollow. Your system begins to reject everything artificial, forced, or inauthentic. That includes careers built from insecurity, relationships based on roles, or even the vision board you crafted from your old self's fear of not being enough. This inner purification often feels like liberation and disorientation at the same time. You're shedding the faults, but what now takes its place? Jung cautioned that many get stuck here. Some awaken and fall into spiritual bypassing, mistaking transcendence for escape. They float above life, call everything an illusion, and convince themselves nothing matters. But detachment is not the same as disconnection. The self does not want you to disappear from the world. It wants to inhabit it through you. It wants to incarnate, not evacuate. It seeks not withdrawal, but embodiment. But before that embodiment, there is a threshold, and Jung described it well, though few recognize it when they are in it. It is the grey space after awakening, the void that comes not with bliss, but with bewilderment. It doesn't look poetic. It doesn't trend. It looks like sitting quietly while the world speeds past, unable to explain who you are becoming. Jung would say you are not failing, you are in between. You have stepped out of the ego, but the self has not yet become your foundation. This liminal space is not a mistake. It is initiation, a descent into the unknown that modern culture has no patience for. Stillness is misdiagnosed as laziness. Pause is confused for paralysis. So you begin to judge yourself, and that judgment becomes the very wall that blocks the energy your soul is calling home. This phase is sacred. It is chrysalis, not collapse. And if you can stay here long enough, if you can resist the urge to rush or retreat, you will begin to feel it, the quiet pulse of something deeper rising. The self is not loud, but it is constant. And it is waiting for you to trust what cannot yet be named. Carl Jung had a word for this sacred reversal of energy, enantiodromia, the phenomenon where something, when taken to its extreme, transforms into its opposite. And nowhere is this more evident than in the aftermath of awakening. You move from the manic striving of ego, I must do everything, to the hollow stillness of soul. Why do anything at all? The pendulum swings not because you're broken, but because balance demands it. The psyche, long imprisoned in performance, finally collapses into rest. And this descent is not pathology, it is initiation. In the language of myth, this is the archetype of the hermit, the withdrawal from the world before rebirth. It is the sacred cocoon where the caterpillar dissolves into formlessness, no longer a crawling self, not yet a flying one. It is the goo phase, unstructured, undefined, unproductive by every modern standard, but necessary, because the psyche is undergoing alchemical transformation, and transformation, Jung would say, begins in darkness, not in bypassing, not in good vibes only, but in descent. This is where modern spirituality often loses its depth, by glamorizing awakening while avoiding its crucifixion. Jung insisted that the shadow, the rejected, uncomfortable, unconscious parts of ourselves, is not something to escape, but something to integrate. Shadow work is not advanced-level spirituality. It is the very foundation of becoming whole. And in this state of nothingness you now occupy, the unconscious is rising, not as a villain, but as a messenger. What you once repressed, your grief, your rage, your unmet needs, begins to surface because now, at last, there is space. So the ego panics. It wants action, clarity, a name tag. But the self, quietly and persistently, whispers, let go. I am forming something deeper. And this is where the real work begins. Not in achievement, but in surrender. Not in clarity, but in witnessing. The psyche is not malfunctioning. It is metabolizing years of noise, illusion, and false striving. It halts your drive, your ambition, your hunger, so you have no choice but to sit with what you've buried, and it is in that stillness, in that haunting void, that you begin to remember. And then, almost imperceptibly, something stirs. A new form of motivation arises, but it is nothing like the old. It is not born of anxiety. It is not urgent or performative. It does not roar, it hums. A soul-led impulse to move, not because you must, but because it would be a betrayal of truth not to. Jung called this the emergence of the self, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living, breathing compass within. It does not chase, it calls, and what it calls you toward is not success, but wholeness. So, you've crossed the threshold and stood in the silence. You've tasted stillness, not as stagnation, but as sacred pause. You've wandered through the inner night, where no voice called out and no light showed the way. And now, something ancient begins to stir, not as a roar, not as lightning, but as a quiet, inner, a soft pulse that does not urge you to return to what was, but invites you to build what has never yet been. This is the first whisper of the self, not in language, but in feeling, in pull, in presence. Carl Jung called this the symbolic life, a life no longer ruled by ego or convention, but guided by the deeper forces of the soul. Once the ego has surrendered and the unconscious is honored, life ceases to be a game of survival and becomes an unfolding of meaning. And here's the paradox. It may look beautifully ordinary. When the self begins to lead, you no longer hustle. You respond. You're not driven by the fear of missing out, but by the quiet conviction of inner alignment. You stop chasing clarity as a prize and begin recognizing it when it arrives, often dressed in simplicity. Living from the self does not mean you'll always be energized or certain. Fatigue, doubt, and grief still pass through. This is the texture of human life. But what disappears is the constant ache of self-betrayal, the dull exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that no longer fits. Instead, something shifts. You find yourself creating, even when no one applauds, saying no, even when yes is expected, following wonder rather than ticking boxes. You begin choosing peace over performance. This is not inertia, it's a new fuel, not adrenaline, but alignment. Not pressure, but presence. Jung called this living symbolically, not as an escape into fantasy, but as a return to soul. You begin to trust the language of dreams, gut instincts, symbols, and synchronicities. Your life becomes a dialogue, not a monologue shouted into the void, but a conversation with the unseen. And what does that look like? Sometimes it's as subtle as different questions. Not, what should I do, but what is quietly calling me? Not, what's the plan, but where is life nudging me? Not, how can I prove myself, but what feels true? You stop trying to dominate life and start participating with it. Ambition doesn't vanish, it transforms. It becomes devotion. Devotion to what is real, what is true, what brings you alive. And strangely, that devotion moves mountains. It gets things done. But from wholeness, not depletion. Now it is sustainable. Now it is soul-powered. This is the self's motivation, not to impress, but to express. And it leads you, often without effort, to create, to teach, to heal, to serve. Not because you should, but because your whole being says yes. So, if you've been wondering where your spark went after awakening, remember, it's not gone. The old fire burned away so a deeper flame could emerge, one that won't flicker in the storms of the world. Carl Jung never promised ease, but he did promise depth. If you are here, reading this, then you are already walking the path. This is not the end of your awakening, it is the beginning of your becoming. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here, in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this: when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation, that is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.